Boldwood presents Reckless, written by Gemma Rogers and read by Georgia Maguire. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1, September 2018. It wasn't a collision. There was no crunching of metal or shattering glass, but the sound of tyres screeching across the tarmac drowned out the voice of Roman Kemp on Capital Radio. I winced in my seat, gripping the steering wheel in an attempt to control the car as we skidded across the road. The back end of my Audi A3 swung out, shaking my daughter and I inside like rag dolls before bumping against the grassy bank of the roundabout. The seatbelt locked and dug into my chest as the side of my head thudded against the window. I flung my arm out across Charlotte's chest, terrified she was going to fly out of her seat as we came to an abrupt halt. Disorientated by the ringing in my ears, time slowed. Sharp, shooting pains flew down my neck, each movement drawn out in contrast to my racing heart. "Are you okay?" I looked at my 15-year-old daughter in the passenger seat, gaping at me. She managed a nod as I patted her thigh. I put my hands back on the wheel, knuckles white as I struggled to catch my breath. "Mum, you okay?" Charlotte's face was ashen, eyes wide and now brimming with tears. Head throbbing, I raised my hand to feel the beginnings of a tender bump hidden beneath my hair. I flinched. "Jesus, he was driving like a dickhead," she exclaimed. A car horn sounded, pulling me back to the moment, and I saw him through the haze of raindrops that littered my windscreen. The weather was unusually wet for the beginning of September. It seemed like it had rained for days. The ground was saturated. The driver of the old black boxy-shaped Ford Fiesta that had pulled out into my path, causing me to slam on the brakes and lose control on the slippery road, stared at me. We locked eyes. His, like Charlotte's, wide and panicked. He was young, just a stupid kid. Teeth gritted, I tried to articulate the word that was forming, rolling it around my mouth before I could spit it out. The car had stalled, but Stormzy blared out of the speakers relentlessly. I started the engine and lowered my window, ignoring the beeping behind me. Watching him trying to start his car, to leave the scene. I could hear his engine turning over, but refusing to come to life and give him an escape. Our cars were blocking both lanes of the roundabout at a standstill, mine facing his driver's door. Leaning my head out of the window as far as I could, pinned by my seatbelt, I shouted, "You absolute twat!" He stared at me, open-mouthed, as though he wanted to reply, but then his car sprang to life and he tore off, wheels spinning, still driving too fast for the conditions. The rain had stepped up a gear since we'd stopped, now hammering on the roof. Cars were queuing behind me, and horns of commuters on their way to work screamed impatiently. Not caring that I'd seen mine and my daughter's lives flash before my eyes only seconds earlier, no one had got out of their car to check we were all right. No one wanted to get wet. Sighing, I manoeuvred the car into first gear and slowly eased away, indicating to leave the roundabout, unable to stop my hand trembling on the gear stick. "Mum?" Charlotte's voice was stronger now, the shock ebbing away. "I'm fine. Are you okay?" I saw her nod in my peripheral vision. Ugh, what an idiot. My face contorted, and I could feel the perspiration at the base of my spine seeping into my cream blouse. The drumming in my chest slowly returning to its natural rhythm. I didn't need this today. The first day of the summer term, a new school for both of us. I was desperate to make a good impression, Charlotte's navy uniform had been pressed, her brogues glistening, her hair in a neat plait, mine smoothed and tucked behind my ears. Everything had to be perfect, but now I was a flustered mess. 15 minutes later, after a slow drive in which I was reluctant to move out of third gear, we arrived at the car park. I felt like I'd held my breath the entire journey and was grateful to find there were spaces left. Even with the near accident, we weren't late, having left the house in plenty of time. I parked away from the entrance, Charlotte hopping out as soon as the engine was off, desperate to leave the confines of the car. I followed, smoothing my clothes before closing my door, then opening it again. "Really, Mum? Today?" Charlotte sighed as I counted to 4. I bit down on my molars. There was no point in explaining again. It was a compulsion, an anxiety tic of sorts. The therapist I saw when it started had said it was a coping mechanism for times of increased stress. A repetitive action that helped me regain control of the situation and of myself. It had become second nature, and something I did automatically now to feel calmer. Charlotte didn't understand. Not today, on the first day at a new school. It was all about her. Wasn't that what all teenagers were like? I knew she was nervous as she pulled on her earlobe and twisted her plain gold stud. She rolled her eyes at me, her mouth giving way to a smile as she took in my proud stare. "Good luck. Have a wonderful day. Hey, text me if you need to, but don't get into trouble for using your phone." "You too, Mum." She turned on her heels and headed for the main entrance, out of the drizzle, leaving me behind. I knew it was going to be that way. I hadn't expected anything less. I retrieved my satchel from the boot and counted the number of times I locked and unlocked the car as I left the car park. The key fob hot in my hand. Always 4. Everything was 4. The sun broke through the clouds and there was a brief pause in the rain as I stood to take in the looming old building of St Wilfrid's Comprehensive, its red brick 2-storey exterior with peeling white sash windows situated on the largest grounds I'd encountered. It looked almost Gothic from the outside, like an old boarding school. It was certainly big enough, and I knew it would be a while until I found my way around. It was a new start in Rusper, just outside Horsham in West Sussex, where I would be teaching English and Charlotte would be going into Year 11. She turned 16 in January next year and was going into her final year of high school. My stomach clenched at the enormity of it. This had to work. It just had to. Groups of children gathered by the doors, a sea of navy blazers and white shirts. I waited until there was a gap and moved inside. The long corridor was brightly lit. White walls displaying artwork, mosaics and watercolours, and a trophy cabinet positioned outside the headmaster, Mr. Scott's office. His door was shut and I could hear muffled voices inside, so I decided not to interrupt. "Excuse me, could you tell me where the staff room is, please?" I asked a girl loitering nearby. She was around Charlotte's age and wore thick black eyeliner around her chestnut eyes. "It's the last door on the left, miss," she replied, pointing down the corridor before heading in the opposite direction. I'd been inside the school before for my interview and had a brief tour, but only remembered Mr. Scott's office. I found toilets before the staff room and slipped inside, grateful they were empty. I imagined most of the teachers were already in their classrooms preparing for the day ahead. I wanted a moment to tidy my hair and put on a dash of lipstick. The cream blouse and navy pencil skirt I'd chosen was my smart but functional outfit until I saw how the other teachers dressed. In some schools, teachers wore suits, but in others their attire was more relaxed. I hoped it was the latter. My face was still pale, the colour yet to return to my cheeks. The queasy feeling that had started in the pit of my stomach was drowned out by the throbbing of my head from the collision with the window. Spraying some perfume across my blouse, I took a moment to regain my composure. Pushing aside the anger bubbling beneath the surface at the other driver who'd been so reckless. First day nerves took hold, and I zipped my bag open and shut, again and again. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can do this. It's a new start, a new life in a new town. Just then, a text came through on my phone. Sliding my finger across the screen, I saw it was from my husband, David. Good luck. You'll be fantastic. Kiss. Steadying my breathing until I felt in control, I pulled open the door and stepped into the busy corridor, almost colliding with the frowning headmaster. Oh, there you are. Welcome, Isabel. He smiled, opening his arms wide, and for a worrying second, I thought he was going to envelop me in a hug. Izzy, call me Izzy. Sorry, you had someone in your office, I explained, but he waved me away. No problem. Now, Izzy, let me take you through to your classroom. As I mentioned before, you have a lovely Year 8 class that you'll be form room teacher for. You'll be known as 8C. They are all aged between 12 and 13. They'll be with you for about 20 minutes twice a day, each morning and afternoon, where you'll take the register. I looked after them for part of last year, and they are a smashing bunch. Mr. Scott strode quickly down the corridor, and I hurried to keep up, my skirt too tight at the knee to walk fast. Why did he look after a form? In my previous school, that would have been unorthodox for a head teacher. Will I teach my lessons from the same classroom? I asked. Yes, absolutely. That will be your classroom. He glanced over his shoulder. Still raining out there? I nodded, remembering my umbrella in the boot of the car. Afraid so, but I think it's slowing down. The great British summertime, eh? I said, palms dampening as a tirade of bewildered-looking students pushed through the doors and ploughed towards us. Someone bumped my shoulder and mumbled an apology. Stevens, Mr. Scott said sternly. The boy turned around and my stomach plummeted to the floor like a sack of potatoes. Yes, sir, he replied in a bored tone, his mouth in a tight smile. You bumped into Mrs. Cole. Can you apologise, please? He hadn't seen me properly, hadn't registered me yet, but I saw him, clearer now he wasn't behind a windscreen. Blonde shaven head, blue eyes, vaguely resembling a young Jude Law. Athletic looking, he stood almost as tall as the head teacher. Our eyes met, and I thought I heard him gasp. His smile faded, and he stuttered, I did. He did, I agreed, unsure why I was defending him. I eyed him coldly. He could have killed us this morning. Off you go and tuck that shirt in, Mr. Scott instructed, nodding towards his untucked T-shirt before we carried on down the corridor. As he held open the classroom door to 8C, I glanced behind me in the direction we'd come from. The boy, last name Stevens, was still standing there, staring at me. A permanent fixture in the corridor as students scurried around him. I paused, my hand briefly touching the small mound on my head. My thumping skull stepped up a notch. Mr. Scott's voice was muffled in the background. As I crossed the threshold into the classroom, I took one last look down the corridor. Sure, I saw the corners of the boy's mouth curl upward. Chapter 2. I tried to focus on Mr. Scott's voice, but he sounded like he was underwater. My head throbbed. I should take some painkillers. I would when I was on my own. I took a deep breath and forced my mouth into a smile, trying to pull myself back to the present. As you can see, the children are very enthusiastic about English lessons here. The classroom was bright and colourful, with work displayed on the walls, as well as many large images of well-known book covers. The faces of Matilda and Harry Potter stared down at us. "Looks fantastic," I agreed, and he grinned appreciatively. "Right, I'll let you get settled. The register is here." Mr. Scott pointed to the black folder on my desk. He patted my shoulder before leaving, and as soon as he'd gone, I sank into the chair, relieved to be alone for a short while. Tearing through my handbag, I unearthed an old packet of paracetamol and took 2 dry, swallowing hard. The chalkiness made me balk. Shockwaves reverberated around my body as the revelation sank in. He was a bloody student. There were too many kids driving around in fast cars. They should raise the driving age to 21. He had to be a sixth former, but even so, still a student. One that I had sworn at in public this morning. The bell rang out, making me jump. I felt like a bag of nerves, barely holding it together. When had I become so weak, so anxious? I knew exactly when, but it didn't help. I held the base of the seat, my fingers drumming on the wood. It was my anchor. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. I waited for the feeling to pass. Within seconds, the noise outside the classroom escalated. There were loud shouts, laughter, and the stomping of feet. Pupils darted into the room and sat at empty desks. Most of them looked happy to be at school. For some children, the school holidays were long, and school was their escape. Occasionally, it presented the only social life they had. There were always a couple of children slouched in their chairs, looking like they'd been dragged out of their beds 10 minutes before the bell rang, and this morning was no exception. "Good morning, everyone," I said loudly, ignoring my churning stomach. The beginning of a new school year was always the hardest. The raucous class fell silent. "My name is Mrs. Cole, and today is my first day at St. Wilfrid's. Now, as you all had your first day this time last year, I hope you'll be extra helpful to me this week as I learn all your names." The crowd of faces beamed back at me, and I felt my shoulders ease. I called each name from the register, and everyone answered. I handed out planners and individual timetables to each of the children, who pored over them at their desks. "Great, a full house today. So, who would like to tell me about their summer holiday?" I asked the class, my eyebrows arched expectantly. For a few moments, no one spoke, until a boy at the back raised his hand. He had brown hair styled into a quiff and exuded the boyish confidence of someone popular amongst his peers. "I moved to a new house, Mrs. Cole. That was pretty cool. We had to have takeaway every night for a week because we had no oven." He gesticulated wildly as he spoke, and I warmed to him immediately. That does sound exciting. And guess what? I moved to a new house too, but I wasn't lucky enough to have a week of takeaways. The class laughed, and a couple of other children took their turn to talk about their time away. One of them went to Disneyland, which everyone was extremely interested in hearing about. 20 minutes flew by, and before I knew it, the bell rang again, and the children filed out of the door, most of them clutching their timetables, trying to ascertain where they were going next. The corridor outside bustled and echoed with shouts, but within a couple of minutes, I heard heavy classroom doors slamming, and it was quiet once more. I had an hour where I didn't have a class and was going to use the time to familiarise myself with the school and prepare what I could for the rest of the week. I was teaching a Year 9 class at 10 o'clock and looked over my lesson plan. My iPhone vibrated on the desk and I smiled down at a message sent from my best friend, Stella. "Knock 'em bandy." Despite the traumatic start to the day, I felt calmer after meeting my form room children. The school had been a good choice. David and I made the right decision to move. I could feel it. We previously lived in Wallington, a London suburb, but Charlotte got into a bad crowd. She followed around a girl called Lisa, started skipping school, her grades plummeted, and she was finally suspended when caught smoking on the grounds. I wanted to get her out of there. David worked in finance and had been approached around Easter by his former colleague, Patrick, who owned part of a public relations company in Hove. David was interested in moving, hating the daily commute to London, but nervous to jump ship, so gratefully declined. When Charlotte got suspended in July, David got back in touch with Patrick and, tempted with promises of less hours and more money, he made the leap, and we searched for schools. When we found St Wilfrid's, I was immediately impressed. The Ofsted rating was good, and it had a sixth form attached with a variety of media courses available that I could see Charlotte would be interested in. During a tour, I got a feel of the place. Charlotte seemed keen, and when I saw they offered the same GCSE options and the syllabus at St Wilfrid's was nearly identical to what she'd been previously learning, it was a no-brainer. I enrolled her to start in the coming September. It was only by chance, when I mentioned to Mr. Scott that I was looking in the surrounding areas for a teaching position, that he said they had a vacancy for an English teacher. At first, I wasn't sure how it would work. Charlotte attending the same school I'd be teaching at, but she said it didn't bother her as long as I kept my distance. When I discussed it with Mr. Scott, he said he wasn't fazed at it as it was Charlotte's last year, as long as I didn't teach her directly. David thought, if anything, it would be a good opportunity to keep an eye on her, to ensure she was on the straight and narrow. Once committed, we found the perfect house in Rusper, amidst a row of 5 detached cottages that were surprisingly spacious on the inside, with a large gravel driveway and separate garage. I fell in love with the rustic fireplace and family kitchen. Our offer to purchase was accepted. We engineered the move during the school summer holiday, and everything seemed to slot into place. After the awful year we'd had, we saw it as a sign that we'd been given another chance to be happy. Glancing back at the plan, I saw the Year 10s were going to be starting Romeo and Juliet, which, at 14 and 15, was always met with lots of sniggering and lewd comments. Footsteps in the corridor caused me to look up, and I saw a figure stride past the door, our eyes connecting for a split second before he was gone. I forced my gaze back to the sheet of paper and gripped the arm of the chair. The footsteps paused and resumed, this time back towards the classroom, until a head popped around the doorframe. "Miss?" I was pretending to read, my knee twitching under the desk, but I glanced up like I'd only just noticed him. "Hello?" My voice caught in my throat. A sheepish grin emerged on his face, and he stepped into the classroom. Towering over me, he had a strong, angular jaw, piercing sky-blue eyes and pearly white teeth. Good-looking, without a doubt, but he knew it. "I'm really sorry about this morning. It was you on the roundabout, wasn't it, miss? I mean, I recognise your face, although you don't look so angry now." Impertinent little sod. By the look of him, I was sure he'd be able to talk his way out of anything, but remembering what I'd called him, I had to tread wisely. "Was that you? You need to be careful. You could have killed yourself pulling out without looking." He had the good grace to look suitably ashamed. "What's your name?" Nicky Stevens, miss, and I'm late for PE, but I wanted to apologise." Flashing me an awkward smile, he left to go to his lesson. It could have been uncomfortable if he'd taken offence to being called a twat this morning. Would he be in any of my lessons? I hope not. The rest of the day went as planned, although my mind wandered to Charlotte and how her first day might be going. My morning lessons were pleasant. The children were well behaved, and at lunchtime I braved the staff room. It was a large square room with one green 3-seater sofa and 2 mismatched armchairs around an oblong wooden coffee table displaying various degrees of tea-stained rings. There was a kitchenette at the end of the room with a fridge, a few cupboards, a microwave and a kettle. I placed the Tupperware pot of cold pasta salad on the worktop and awkwardly introduced myself to the other teachers. Shaking hands with sweaty palms was never good, but no one commented. I always struggled to hide my nerves. There were 2 women and 2 men, one of whom was Mr. Scott, taking up the kitchenette as the kettle boiled. Deep in conversation, they discussed whether there would be a snap general election, as Boris had promised, if a bill against a no-deal Brexit was passed by MPs. The women were vastly different. One was a plump, friendly-looking lady with grey hair and a warm smile. I guessed instantly she was the art teacher from the way she was dressed, lots of colours thrown together and purple Doc Martens under a long tie-dye skirt. And I was right. She interrupted the debate and introduced herself as Matilda Brown, shaking my hand firmly. The second lady was short and wiry, with glasses and a pointed nose. She smiled, tight-lipped at me, and limply grasped my hand as though she hated physical contact as much as I did. She was Ms. Quinn. No first-name introduction, and was the maths teacher. Next, there was the scruffy history teacher, Mr. Collins, first name Henry, who grunted a welcome, and lastly, Stephen Scott, who'd come into the staff room for the purpose of introducing me to the other teachers. I cast my eye around the room. It seemed from the various attire that I didn't have to worry about what I wore. There was a mixture of formal and informal. I relaxed, knowing I didn't have to conform either way, and my previous work wardrobe would be fine. Mr. Ross, a latecomer to the staff room, breezed in. He was the PE teacher, a no-nonsense Scotsman who, as soon as we were introduced, asked me if I'd seen Nicky Stevens that morning. The mention of his name made me slop a tiny amount of tea over the side of my cup as my hand trembled. Apparently, Nicky had blamed me for his late arrival as I'd accosted him on the way to his lesson. It was easier to agree than to explain I had almost crashed into his car this morning and he'd stopped to apologise. It played on my mind throughout my last lesson of the day, and I was grateful when Charlotte slunk into my empty classroom at 3:10, still trying to avoid being identified as the daughter of a teacher by her peers. She told me on the way home that her day had been okay. She was still working out who was who in the social hierarchy. I knew the move wouldn't have been easy for her. She didn't think there was a problem where she'd been before. Our relationship had been fractious ever since. "How's your head?" she asked. I gingerly touched the lump, the pain easing. "Good, thank you." "Can you believe he goes here?" I said, shaking my head. "What, to St. Wilfrid's?" I nodded, glimpsing Charlotte's open mouth. "He came to see me in my classroom to apologise." "Oh, I hope you told him to piss off," Charlotte replied, without batting an eyelid. I gave her a sharp look. No, I did not, funnily enough." The radio was turned up for the rest of the journey, and as soon as we got home, Charlotte vanished to her room to boot up her laptop. Facebooking or Instagramming or whatever it was teenagers did that incurred so many hours online. Our neighbour Mary popped round almost as soon as we got back. She'd introduced herself the day we moved in, having lived in the cottage next door for 30 years. Her and her husband Bob were retired. Since our arrival, she'd popped in every couple of weeks, delivering scones and cakes, much to David's delight. Today, a batch of still warm blueberry muffins were handed over, as she reminded me the bin men were coming tomorrow. We chatted for 5 minutes on the doorstep, Mary declining my offer to come in. I made a mental note to pick up some flowers for her. I sat on the sofa with a mug of tea and a muffin. I had no homework to mark and no lessons to plan for tomorrow, as I'd managed to get that done in my free period. The house was deathly quiet, the only noise from the clock ticking above the fireplace. David would be home later. Perhaps we could watch a movie together, crack open a bottle of wine to celebrate my first day. I headed into the kitchen to make a bolognese sauce, humming to myself. At 5:30, as I was setting the table and about to dish up, David called my mobile. I'm sorry, I've got a conference call with the US at 6. Shouldn't be more than an hour. I tried to keep my voice upbeat as I told him it was fine, but I knew he wouldn't be home before 8. If this was what his new job was going to be like, we wouldn't be spending as much time together as I'd initially thought. Chapter 3. When the front door opened, I glanced at the clock. It was 9:15, much later than I'd realised. Charlotte and I had eaten dinner together, discussing Mr. Ross, whom she declared as evil because he had made them wear disgusting tabards in PE that had never been washed. She seemed totally unfazed by the transition to St. Wilfrid's, and I was relieved her day had been a good one. Afterwards, Charlotte went upstairs to do science homework on the periodic table. I cleared up and sat in the lounge, watching a true crime documentary. I loved them, and fancied myself as a bit of an amateur detective. David swooped in and kissed me on the forehead before going into the kitchen to reheat his dinner. I'd left it in the microwave, as I always did. "How was your day?" I called, finishing my glass of wine and knocking back some more painkillers. My bump was now a dull ache, but irritating nonetheless. "Busy. Yours? How was school?" "Oh, fine, apart from some idiot on the road this morning. Charlotte seems to like it." "Great," he said. No further conversation followed. He didn't even inquire about my journey to work. He ate his dinner at the table, casually perusing the newspaper he'd brought home. When he finished, he flopped beside me in front of the television, stifling a yawn. It was obvious he was tired, but when I announced I was going to bed at 10, he didn't follow. Feeling slightly rejected, I cleaned my teeth and got into bed. I knew David was anxious about making a good impression at his new job. He'd started 3 weeks ago, determined to hit the ground running. Whenever David encountered any stress, he would shut down and I'd have to wait for him to snap out of it. I gritted my teeth and rolled over, plumping my pillow with my fist. It wasn't just the pressure of his new job or the recent move. He'd been distant for a while, but there was nothing I could do to fix it. I couldn't change the past, however much I wanted to. The next morning, David had gone by the time I woke. He usually left for work early, preferring the quieter roads to the congested school run, and said it was a less stressful start to the day. I wished I had that option, but I'd always been the one to do the school runs. I woke Charlotte and we both got ready for school. The sky was overcast, and as we left, it began to rain again. The warmth of summer had abruptly ended with the start of the term. As a result, the roads were busy and I arrived a little later than planned, although with less drama than yesterday's commute. As I shook out my umbrella and hooked it onto the coat stand in the corner of the classroom, I noticed a cup on my desk. A Starbucks takeaway coffee cup, steam protruding from the hole in the lid. Bemused, I slid into my seat and picked it up. Latte had been ticked on the selection, but there was no name written on the side. Instead, a yellow post-it note was peeling off the cardboard as it was so hot. It had one word written on it in thick black capital letters. Sorry. Was it for me? I frowned. Who'd felt the need to apologise? Had I missed something, or was it meant for someone else? I was in the right classroom, wasn't I? I looked around at the now familiar pictures on the walls. Then I remembered the journey to school yesterday morning and the near miss at the roundabout. Surely it couldn't be. The boy from yesterday had brought me a coffee to apologise for his terrible driving. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the offering. If it was him, the gesture seemed mature beyond his years. I braved a sip, pleased to discover it was a latte, the hot liquid burning my throat. "You got it then, miss," came a voice from the door, startling me. A little of the hot liquid leaked onto my hand, searing my skin. "Oh, shit," I scowled, raising my hand to my mouth. Heat engulfed my cheeks. He leaned on the doorframe, looking considerably pleased with himself, smirking at my loss of control. "Oh, sorry about that. I don't normally curse in front of students." His eyebrows lifted and I felt the onset of a hot flush, the silence making me squirm. "Thank you, it's kind of you, but you didn't have to do that." "I did." The bell rang and he turned to leave. Our conversation finished. The classroom swiftly filled with children chattering amongst themselves and throwing bags under desks as they slipped into their seats. I took the register and chatted to some of the children about how they'd found their first day back at school, all the time cradling the coffee, the warmth making my fingertips tingle. It wasn't long before the Year 8s were replaced by Year 7s, who all looked so little. Every year they seemed to look smaller, their pristine uniforms drowning them with backpacks bigger than they were. I couldn't believe Charlotte was that size once. The lesson today had them writing stories with a definitive beginning, middle and end, all on the subject of growth. The explanation I'd given them at the start of class was that growth could mean any number of things, from plants growing to how you could grow as a person. They banded some ideas around between them, and after a few minutes of brainstorming, the class were fully engrossed, and the room fell silent. All the children had their heads bowed, scribbling away in their exercise books and occasionally raising their hands to ask a question. I could hear a PE class outside. It sounded like football from the posts rattling and scuffling of trainers on concrete. It was still drizzling and I didn't envy them playing outside today. A loud bang echoed around the classroom and everyone jumped, heads snapping to the window, just in time to see a football bounce off the narrow wall and zoom into the flower bed. I tutted. At that force it could have smashed the window I'd left ajar to allow some fresh air in. "Carry on, children. I'm going to close the window as they're a noisy bunch out there." I walked over to the paint-chipped sash and pulled it down, spotting Nicky Stevens navigating the path between the flower beds towards the building. He was part of a mixed group playing football in the tennis courts, perhaps doing a PE A-level. He had to be in sixth form if he was old enough to drive. He grinned when he saw me, his walk becoming a swagger, and mouthed the word "sorry" as he came closer. What must it be like to have that much confidence? I couldn't help but smile at his nerve, but I did shake my head in disapproval. He picked up the ball and kicked it high over the wire fence of the court, back to his teammates with expert precision. They didn't wait, carrying on the game without him. He turned back to award me another smile and stretched his arms over his head in a victory pose as he walked backwards. His rain-sodden t-shirt rode up, showing a glimpse of bare torso beneath. Sitting dangerously low, his shorts revealed the V-shape of his hips and the trail of hair descending beneath. My face flushed as he caught me looking. It was exactly what he'd intended. I turned away quickly, cheeks now a vivid scarlet, and hurried back to my desk. My eyes darted around the room to see if anyone had noticed the exchange, but the children had resumed their stories. What had just happened? How would I let myself get drawn into that charade? Clearly, I had to be more careful with him. There was no doubt that display was deliberate, and I'd fallen for it. Even a rumour these days was enough to ruin a teaching career. Nostrils flaring, I launched the empty coffee cup with the note still attached into the bin and sat down to drum my fingers on the underside of my desk. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rest of the day was uneventful in comparison. In the staff room, I chatted with Matilda and Susan, Ms. Quinn, over sandwiches. Susan had volunteered her first name this time, seemingly thawed since our last interaction. They gave me suggestions on restaurants and what there was to do in the area, some of which I'd already explored. Horsham was a market town and had a shopping centre, swimming baths, cinema and theatre. I loved to go to the cinema almost as much as I loved curling up with a good book. I asked for directions to the leisure centre, hoping to go for a swim after school if I could rope Charlotte in too. I always kept a backpack of swim gear in the boot of my car in case I got the opportunity. Where we used to live, in Wallington, I swam at the local pool 3 or 4 times a week, using it as my time to de-stress. Charlotte hadn't been interested in swimming for a few years now, but I persuaded her to come along and sit in the spectator section nonetheless. It seemed as long as she had her phone and could connect to free Wi-Fi, she was happy. Plus, I couldn't deny wanting to keep an eye on her. I had to make sure she stayed out of trouble at St. Wilfrid's. Any time we spent together these days was a bonus. Since the hormones kicked in, it seemed mothers became public enemy number 1, and I was no exception. It was a challenge to say anything to Charlotte without it being misconstrued as criticism. I was often treading on eggshells. Although uncharacteristically, on the drive to the leisure centre, Charlotte shared that she had made a few friends and they'd already asked her what she was doing at the weekend. I refrained from gushing too much, fearing it might make her clam up. I had to trust she'd chosen more wisely this time, as her old friends, Lisa especially, had led her down a path I didn't want to revisit. I wanted her to have a clean record at St. Wilfrid's. Whatever you want to do, honey. I can always drop you in town if you'd like. I've heard there's a good cinema and a bowling alley. Charlotte had always enjoyed the cinema too. I'd been taking her to the toddler mornings on a Saturday since she was 3, whenever there was a good Disney or Pixar movie out. Packing the bag with lots of treats would help to keep her sitting still for 2 hours, which sometimes felt like a marathon. We hadn't been to see anything for ages. The days when all it took was a bag of sweets to coax Charlotte to the cinema were long gone. When we arrived at the pool, it was relatively quiet, except for a few boys showing off for Charlotte's benefit and making the lifeguard blow his whistle at 30-second intervals. My daughter, at 15 years of age, was becoming more attractive every day, and it wouldn't be long before boys were knocking on the door. She had so much spirit, more than I had at her age. Dark and brooding, like her father, but when she got angry, she was as unpredictable as a firework. The transition into the teenage years had been a challenge. I eased into a couple of lengths of breaststroke in a lane I had all to myself. Swimming was my favourite form of exercise. All stress would dissolve and I'd allow myself to daydream. Gliding through the water, being weightless, was blissful, and I even found the smell of chlorine heavenly. I contemplated my day and the move to St. Wilfrid's. So far, it had been a success, and I was hopeful that it would continue. I had bridges to rebuild with David and Charlotte, but for the first time in a while, it felt achievable. Chapter 4. When we got home, Charlotte disappeared to her room. She wanted to ring her friend Lisa from her old school. I wasn't overly happy about it, but I understood that it wasn't fair of me to expect her to cut ties altogether. Plus, it was a fight that I didn't think I'd win. Even though it was early, I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle I'd opened last night. A reward for a good day. We were having chicken fajitas for dinner, but by the time it was ready, the kitchen was a mess. As I laid the table, David came in, dumping his laptop bag in the hallway and striding into the kitchen. He kissed me on the cheek and pinched one of the sliced peppers from the chopping board, tossing it into his mouth before I could object. "Oh, it's lovely to have you home early," I said, giving him a quick squeeze around the middle. But even my good intentions of being affectionate with David felt alien now. With the house move last month and new jobs for us both, there had barely been any time for intimacy. It felt like we were ships passing in the night. "How's the job going?" It was David's 3rd week at his new position, and this was the earliest he'd been home from work since he'd started. Charlotte and I were getting used to eating alone. "Okay, actually. I had to present some projected savings to the Vice President yesterday, which is why I was late back, but it all went well, and I think they're going to implement my suggested changes." I beamed at my clever husband. "You're not the hatchet man, are you?" I laughed. But David shook his head. "No, I leave that to someone in human resources," he joked. "I see." "What about you? How are you finding the rabble at St. Wilfrid's?" "Fine. They seem nice." We sat down to eat when Charlotte eventually emerged from upstairs, informing us that Lisa had been suspended already in her 1st week for fighting. Mine and David's eyes met, silently confirming we'd made the right decision to move schools. After dinner, David changed out of his suit and he and I sat in the lounge to watch the latest satellite movie premiere, or rather, he stared at his mobile all night. By 10, I was yawning and ready for bed. Swimming had taken it out of me. I'd lost my stamina. In the bathroom, I slipped on a silk nightie and cleaned my teeth, leafing through a book in bed until David came upstairs. When he climbed in beside me, the mattress dipping and his body cold, he rolled onto his side to switch off the lamp. I gently pressed myself against his back, caressing the base of his neck with my lips. David reached behind and placed his hand on my thigh, patting it lightly. A minute later, I heard him snore. I turned away, letting a sigh escape, and stared at the ceiling. I'd been dismissed. We had to get over this hump, and there was only one way to do it, but I couldn't do it alone. We hadn't been together physically for over 3 months, and the longer it went on, the harder it was to get back into. I hadn't spoken to David about it yet, hoping it was a blip and there'd be no need for any awkward conversation, but it was fast becoming the elephant in the room. Our sex life had been sporadic at best since last year. I'd accidentally fallen pregnant. A tummy bug had purged my contraceptive pill a few days before a rare night away. And my best friend Stella had stayed over to keep an eye on Charlotte, and we'd booked a night in a hotel in Brighton. It had been such a shock when we found out, as conceiving Charlotte had taken a year of trying, and when we'd tried for another child, it had never happened. Although the pregnancy wasn't planned and the age difference between the children would have been massive, we decided it was a gift. But just before I reached the 16-week mark, I miscarried. We were devastated, and it somehow fractured the relationship between David and I. I was grief-stricken, consumed by guilt, and emotionally shut down. David tried to help me through it, but I became cold and detached. Eventually, he gave up trying to console me, and we'd been papering over the cracks ever since. It became something we never spoke about, although, looking back now, we could have done with some counselling. Charlotte wasn't told about the pregnancy. We were going to surprise her with the scan to show the sex of the baby. There seemed little point in upsetting her to tell her about a brother or sister she would now never have. I'd tell her when she was older. As a result of the miscarriage and complications during the operation to remove the remaining fetus left behind, doctors confirmed I would likely be no longer able to have children. Scar tissue in my uterus and cervix would mean getting pregnant could be problematic. At 39, I felt I was getting a little old, preferring to concentrate on the family I had already. But David changed. He'd said it was like having a winning lottery ticket snatched out of his hand. I'd pushed him away. Sure, he blamed me for the miscarriage. I'd tried to take good care of myself. I'd taken folic acid and extra vitamins, exercised, drank plenty of water, but I couldn't hold on to our baby. Now it felt like I hadn't just lost my baby, but my husband too. I desperately missed how close we used to be. David was always affectionate, and I loved that about him. He never missed an opportunity to grope me in the kitchen, sneaking up behind me when I was doing the washing up and unarmed. I'd been desired, and I wanted us to get back to that place, but wasn't sure how. Exasperated, I put my headphones in and listened to the latest Jane Fallon novel I'd downloaded to drown out David's snoring. On Wednesday, Mr. Scott requested a staff meeting after school, which worked out well as Charlotte asked to go home with one of her new school friends. She gave me the address and asked if I could pick her up on the way back. I was looking forward to meeting them. I was hopeful that Charlotte had learned from her mistakes and would make better choices in whom she spent her time with. The teachers gathered in the IT classroom. A looming room with high tables lining 3 of the 4 walls, a monitor and keyboard for each pupil stationed a few feet apart. We congregated at a bank of desks in the centre. To start, Mr. Scott introduced me to the remaining members of staff I hadn't already met in the staff room, and then moved on to discuss the addition of after-school clubs. He hoped we would have suggestions in our relevant areas of expertise. Mr. Ross, the PE teacher, proposed to coach a netball team after school on a Tuesday, in addition to the mixed football club he already held. I made a mental note to inform Charlotte, sure she would enjoy netball if she could be persuaded to sign up. Matilda asked if she could run a pottery class, to which Mr. Scott agreed, in principle, depending on the cost of the clay. Mr. Collins, the history teacher, was a chess enthusiast and said he would find out if any of the students would be interested before advertising a club. I shifted in my seat, counting silently in my head as I felt my pace quicken. They'd been around the table, but I was yet to contribute. I could run a creative writing club if you think any of the students would be interested. My voice started strong but tailed off when everyone turned to look at me. Fantastic idea, Izzy. Yes, I think that has legs. Catch all those future authors and journalists. Mr. Scott clapped his hands together and I felt the prickle of perspiration on the back of my neck. I drummed my fingers on my thigh, counting until the attention was diverted. I agreed to advertise my club to be held on a Friday after school for an hour, which only gave me 2 days to plan. My chest fluttered as though caged birds were inside at the prospect of running a class where all the pupils that attended wanted to be there. The meeting concluded at 4:30, and as we walked out together, Matilda invited me to join her and Susan for dinner. They were going to get a curry, and I was disappointed I couldn't join, but it was too short notice and I had to get Charlotte. Next time, I promised I'd come along if they gave me a date. I wanted to make friends with my work colleagues, as Stella had moved to Nottingham over the summer to look after her elderly parents. She was only at the end of the phone, and I spoke to her often, but I missed having a girlfriend to go shopping or out for dinner with. These days, I seemed to spend much of my time alone. Deciding it was a bit early to get Charlotte and not wanting to ruin their after-school fun, I ventured into town to find the library. If I could borrow some books on creative writing to have a read-through in preparation for the class, it would be a good start. I hadn't run an after-school class before, so I was nervous at the prospect, although it was a subject I loved. If I was lucky, there might even be some suggested exercises I could use. I'd seen signposts to the library on my way to school, so I had a fair idea of where it was, and after a couple of wrong turns, I eventually found it. Libraries were my favourite places, quiet and peaceful, where time stood still. The smell of books was intoxicating, and hours could be wasted leafing through the latest romance offerings. Today, however, I went straight to the information section and avoided fiction altogether, knowing it was a place I'd lose time. In a peculiar, slow, sidestep walk, with my head leaning to the right so I could read the titles, I found the section on creative writing. Many looked dated, and I took a few out of the bookcases, turning them over to read the back cover before returning them to their rightful places. "Hello, miss." A voice from behind made me start, and I almost dropped the book I was holding. I spun around to see Nicky, shirt now untucked, sporting a mischievous grin. Chapter 5. Hi. I could feel my chest reddening. It was where it began, before it crept up my neck, leaving a mottled pattern in its wake. Oh, this is ridiculous. Why am I blushing? "Nicky," he said, smiling, introducing himself. "How are you?" I asked, trying to appear unflustered. Oh, what was he doing here? I expected him to be running around a football pitch or out with a girlfriend, not knee-deep in books. "Good, thanks. What are you looking for?" His gaze travelled downwards to the book in my hand, nodding appreciatively as I raised it for him to see. "You?" I asked, to be polite. I couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. Nicky's wasn't a year group I was used to dealing with. I'd never taught sixth formers before. They were practically adults. "Sports science for my A-level. I also need to learn about muscles and ligaments for biology." His eyes glossed over me and I pulled my jacket together. The action made his eyes glint. I felt like prey about to be consumed. Physically, he was imposing, tall and broad, and I couldn't help feeling out of my depth, despite being 20 years his senior. "They've got a coffee shop upstairs. Do you want to get one?" Nicky asked. My eyebrows shot up momentarily. He was so self-assured, as though he was talking to a girl his own age and not a teacher. Taken aback, it took a few seconds to formulate a polite but firm response. I'm not sure that's appropriate, Nicky, but thank you." I turned to leave with the book still in my hand, my skin steaming beneath my clothes. "It's not a crime, miss," he called after me as I hurried to the self-checkout machine, feeling foolish for leaving so abruptly. I fumbled around in my bag for my purse, but before I could get my library card out, he was beside me. "Oh, chill out, miss. It's only a coffee. I know you're new here, and if you ever want anyone to show you around, let me know." He shrugged and turned to leave. I felt a pang of guilt as I watched him walk out of the door to his car. Perhaps I wasn't being fair. He was just trying to be kind. Likely an attempt to make amends for how we met. Almost running a teacher off the road wasn't the best first impression, and I was sure he felt embarrassed. Through the glass, I saw he'd parked his car next to mine. Had he followed me here? Oh, no, of course he hadn't. I was being stupid. The near miss the other morning had unsettled me around Nicky. Despite this, I could still feel the telltale thrumming of my pulse in my neck. The self-service machine didn't work, and I had to register for a new card as the one I had was redundant in this borough. The man behind the desk was painstakingly slow and questioned every answer on my form as though I was signing up for an exclusive membership to some secret society. All the time, I tapped my foot, counting steadily to 4 as I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth, waiting for the anxiety to disperse. I hadn't always been this way. I used to be confident, but it seemed the older I got, the more fearful I became. Counting, repetitive actions, and swimming were the only things that calmed me. As the librarian generated my card and my tapping slowed, I consoled myself that Nicky wasn't on the list of A-level English literature students. I checked that morning, worried he might put me off. Blushing like a teenage girl whenever we spoke was embarrassing. The more awkward I felt, the redder I became. Something that had plagued me since childhood. Although as I got older, the episodes became less frequent. Until now, it seemed. I didn't know why he made me so nervous. Something about his manner, his confidence, perhaps. Eventually, I was handed my card and was able to check out the creative writing book. It was one I'd ended up with rather than chosen, distracted by Nicky's arrival, but it would have to do. I typed the postcode into the Audi's sat-nav, feeling silly about my notion of being followed, as Nicky had left the car park already. I took the directions to collect Charlotte, driving through a small, newly built housing estate with picture-perfect semi-detached properties in a line. Amy's house had beautiful silver pots by the front door, filled with pink begonias. I was looking forward to meeting her mother, but Charlotte slipped out of the front door when I rang the bell, closing it firmly behind her. She said she'd had a good time, but didn't offer any more details. I had a feeling she wanted to keep her friends close to her chest, worried that they'd be ripped apart if she formed any attachments I deemed unsuitable. I tried to explain, when we told her we were moving her out of Wallington, that I was only thinking of her future, but she'd refused to listen. She didn't utter a word to me for 2 weeks. Her door was constantly being slammed, and I knew she was struggling with lack of control of her own life. It kept me up at night, worrying we'd made a mistake, but I knew I had to get her away from that crowd. I had visions of the police bringing her home, stoned out of her head, and social services intervening. "Stir-fry for dinner tonight?" I suggested, hoping Charlotte would agree. I wanted something quick and easy so I could have a soak in the bath. Charlotte seemed fine with that idea and reluctantly helped me get the ingredients out when we got home. We were making progress. My attempts at conversation hadn't been brushed off completely, although she rolled her eyes when I complimented her on how well I thought she was doing with the massive change. When I dished up, I still hadn't heard from David, so put a bowl in the microwave for him as usual. Once we'd eaten, Charlotte carried on with homework at the dining table and I went upstairs to run a bath, adding a few drops of moisturising bath soak David had bought me last Christmas. Slipping off my black ankle grazers and polka dot blouse, I stood in front of the mirror in my mismatched underwear. The once white bra had turned a light shade of grey. Perhaps it was time to go shopping. My figure wasn't too bad. A small paunch around the middle I hadn't managed to lose since having Charlotte, but my legs were long and slim. They were my best feature and I needed to get them out more often. Every year I promised myself I would wear more skirts and dresses, but trousers were like a comfort blanket. I wasn't as toned as I used to be, but if I got back into swimming, it would make a difference. The reflection staring back at me wasn't bad for someone soon to be 40. I dyed my hair a mahogany red now, as the greys were beginning to peek through, but I kept it short in an angled bob that was, according to Charlotte, on trend. Sliding into the bath, I sighed and closed my eyes, the warmth soothing. Running my hand over my stomach and watching the water run off my skin, I enjoyed the sensation. I missed being touched. David hadn't touched me in months. I remembered when our sex life had been fun and spontaneous. We were forever giggling, grabbing opportunities when Charlotte wasn't around. For a while, losing the baby had turned my body from a means of pleasure into something I despised. My chance of a baby had been snatched away, and it took time to come to terms with the fact I'd never carry again. As soon as I felt ready, I began reaching out to David, trying to instigate some longed-for intimacy, but he seemed detached. When would he be ready? How long would I have to wait? "Mum!" Charlotte shouted from the bottom of the stairs, jolting me from my thoughts, and I sat up so fast water erupted over the side of the bath. "What?" I shouted back, my voice so high-pitched it was unrecognisable. "Where's my PE kit?" I sighed and picked up the razor to shave my legs. "It's in your PE bag in your wardrobe, already packed." I had yet to get out of the habit of packing PE bags, making lunch boxes and putting away ironing. Charlotte had it way too easy, and she knew it. I didn't linger in the bath. I could feel my mood sinking, so got out and put my pyjamas on. I curled up on my bed, skimming through the creative writing book I'd checked out in a rush. It wasn't the best, quite dated, but I couldn't change it now. Luckily, the trip to the library hadn't been a total waste. There were some exercises on story planning in the book that I could use. How many pupils would attend the after-school class? What if no one came at all? That would be embarrassing. At school the next morning, I saw Nicky across the playground and my stomach lurched. When he saw me, he grinned and waved. I managed a weak smile back. I could see him watching as I walked into school. I hoped it wasn't because of the outfit I'd chosen. As I had free rein over what to wear, I decided to be brave and chose a classic grey shift dress with a red cardigan to complement it. When I bought the dress last year, it came in grey and red, but I didn't have the confidence to buy the red one. I knew it would be another of those outfits in my wardrobe I would put on, look in the mirror, and then change into something else as the voice in my head whispered, "It isn't you." I'd ignored that voice, coming downstairs and earning a wolf whistle from David, who was working from home. I'd smiled and rolled my eyes, refraining from challenging him on his empty promise. It'd only been a light-hearted whistle, no desire burned in his eyes. I couldn't remember the last time there had been. Perhaps I could suggest couples therapy. Would David be up for that? We needed to find our way back to each other. Charlotte hadn't been quite as impressed when we'd got in the car. She didn't mention the dress, but that wasn't a surprise. I could probably leave the house naked and she wouldn't notice. I chose not to dwell on it and instead slotted the netball class into conversation. Surprisingly, Charlotte appeared interested in signing up. It transpired that Amy was sporty, so she figured they could do it together. I was delighted Charlotte was having a good week and settling in well. With her happy, it took the pressure off and I could concentrate on making this move work for all of us. I'd make more of an effort with David to talk about the miscarriage and not gloss over it like we had been. It was a day of Shakespeare. I was teaching Romeo and Juliet in the morning, then an hour on sonnets, followed by Macbeth in the afternoon, which was my favourite. The story so dark and twisted, I fell in love with the witches the first time I read it. I was more excited about my lessons than the weekend ahead, which was likely to be filled with finishing the unpacking. I hoped we could manage to squeeze in dinner and a movie, a suitable reward for completing the move. It was my turn on playground duty, which Matilda kindly pointed out on the rota in the staff room. I hadn't noticed there was one, but wandering around outside at break time, making sure none of the children were up to anything.